I'm Pake Sutton, and this is the Southern Pine Beetle Management and Suppression PowerPoint. Here's the problem. The Southern Pine Beetle is one of the most destructive insects that is wreaking havoc on North American forests. An estimated 100 million board feet of saw timber is lost annually because of the beetle, and that's according to the U.S. Forest Service. And around 30 million board feet of pulpwood, which is used in paper production, can be lost annually because of the pine beetle. And here we have a picture of the pine beetle right there, and then we have a picture of him burrowing into the pine trees. You can see the problem going on right there. Here's a map of the area that the pine beetle can cover. He covers all the southeast United States, all the way up, kind of run along the Mason-Dixon line up into parts of Pennsylvania and Ohio. These are the areas that the pine beetle can devastate. And even the little tracts of forest land starting in Arizona and going all the way down into Mexico and into parts of Honduras and Nicaragua. And then there's a sort of a subspecies, another species of pine beetle that affects our northwestern states, and that's called the mountain pine beetle, which is an epidemic in of itself, which is another problem. But for this presentation, we're just going to focus on the southern pine beetle and the effects that it has on our timber. Here's a picture of what the southern pine beetle can do. This photo was taken in Missouri, and you can see all the dead trees here. These are called spots. The pine beetles will attack the trees, and you can see here in the very dark areas is the area that was attacked first. And they'll just spread from tree to tree, making these big brown spots in the forest areas. Now here's the infestation process in a nutshell. Pine beetles infest trees for mating purposes. Females will single out a tree and release pheromones, and those pheromones signal to the males to come on in for mating purposes, and they'll mate with the females. And then after the mating process is over, the beetles will begin burrowing into the bark, into the tree, and lay their eggs into the cambium. And then throughout this entire process, the tree is producing resin, which is that sticky stuff you saw in a picture a little while ago. And this resin is a defense mechanism that the tree uses to try to force the beetle out of the tree. And then in small outbreaks, the resin will work and it'll force the beetle out. But in outbreaks that we're seeing across southern Southeast America, that resin is not doing its job because the beetles are just attacking in such large numbers. The beetles will also inoculate the tree with what's called a blue fungi, and this helps the beetle penetrate through the sapwood or the resin, breaking down that resin and moving on into the inner layers of the tree. And the infestation process continued. As I said, it was as a means of mating purposes, and once the eggs hatch, the beetle larvae will feed on the wood fibers, and you can see all the boreholes where the beetles go in. And then these circle areas and big areas are called chambers where the eggs are laid. And then when the eggs hatch, they turn into larvae. Those young beetles will feed on the fibers in the tree, and eventually they'll make their way out, further damaging the tree. And this process overwhelms the tree eventually because the tree is using all this defense mechanism to fight off the beetles. But it eventually overwhelms the tree, and the tree is more susceptible to disease and other pests taking over, and eventually it is overwhelmed and it dies. Now, pine species that can be infected, loblolly, which is most common here in Arkansas, that's the most common pine tree in Arkansas, and those take the majority of hits from the pine beetle, but also shortleaf pines, pitch pines, pond pines, and Virginia pines can be infected. And even in rare cases, an infestation can spread to certain spruce, cedar, and hemlock species. In this picture, we see a loblolly pine that has been overtaken by the pine beetle. Now, suggested management techniques for suppression. Foresters can do one of three things to suppress beetle outbreaks. Number one, they can do a salvage removal method of it. This is where infested or vacated trees are salvaged and removed out of the forest. Chemical control on healthy trees, which is like spraying chemicals, pesticides, and such. And then pile and burn infested and vacated trees to get rid of the pine beetle. Number one, salvage removal. When an infested spot is found in a pine forest, the owner or manager can cut down and remove the infected trees. They also can create a buffer zone by cutting down a ring of healthy trees around the infected trees to ensure that no further spreading of the beetle can occur. Now, some benefits to this method is that the timber that is harvested, if it is harvested on a timely basis, can provide some financial return via lumber processing. So the landowner or manager can call in a crew to come in, log, and cut down the infested trees. If it's at the right time when the trees are still predominantly healthy, then they can get some financial gain by selling that timber. Now, a disadvantage to this method is the timing must be right. If you wait too long, and if the timber stands too long infected, then the quality and the price of the lumber goes down. Number 2, chemical control. This technique is effective in controlling individual or small stands of trees. Registered pesticides are all available for killing and suppressing the pine beetle and preventing the pine beetle. A crew is hired to come and spray chemicals with the hydraulic sprayer. This technique can only be used for prevention. Healthy, uninfected trees are the ones that will be sprayed. This is a prevention technique, which is one of the benefits, and can stop a beetle infestation before it happens. This is a good option for urban areas such as your parks, recreational areas, and small commercial forests. However, a disadvantage is this is a very expensive method and is not recommended for large stands of trees because it's too difficult to get into those areas, and an environmental concern comes up with this process too. Number 3, pile and burn. Infested trees are cut and then piled up using a bulldozer. Then once they are felled, they are set ablaze to burn the infected timber and kill any remaining beetles in the wood. This is one of the oldest techniques that has been used to suppress the pine beetle. A buffer zone is also created and you cut healthy trees around the infected area to prevent the spreading and regeneration of the pine beetle. Benefits to pile and burn. This method is effective at eradicating the pine beetle within those infected trees and those infected areas. However, a disadvantage is this method is also very expensive. And there is also another environmental concern because of the carbon emissions and ash that are being put off because of the burning. Now, my recommendations for people in this field would be, based on my research, I've determined that the salvage removal method is the best management technique that can be used to suppress and stop the spreading of the pine beetle. You should hire a crew to cut down the infested trees in a timely fashion, of course, and have the timber trucked out to the mills for processing. Now, why did I choose the salvage removal? Both the chemical control and pile and burn methods have too many negative impacts on the environment. You don't want those chemicals getting into your water sources, into other animal food sources, infecting other animals, because the chemicals can affect other species and pollute the water resources. The ash and smoke from pile and burn are pollutants. They're particulates that can infect animals, and they don't need to be added to the forest. The salvage removal is the only method that has a payoff with financial gain at the end. So you're paying for a crew to come out there and cut down the timber, but you're also making money off that timber if it is cut in a timely fashion. And that's via the land manager or owner selling the infected timber to a lumber company. And here's my works cited. Thanks for listening.